We are continuing, and all of a sudden things get serious here as I've been kind of wondering. Hadn't been looking ahead too much at the lessons that are in the material we're using, but I knew that the first 13 lessons are supposed to cover chapters 1 through 39, and there we hit about lesson 7, and we're still in chapter 12, and I thought, that's kind of the Jason Fish approach to covering things. You start off covering, saying all that you want to say, and then all of a sudden at the end you have to cover a bunch because you left too much to go. But we'll do chapters 13 through 23 tonight, which is 11 chapters. We've covered 12 chapters in 7 weeks, and now in 1 week we're going to cover 11 chapters. But we can do it. Sure we can. Does everybody have a handout? There was a stack back there, and there's a lot of stuff to write down tonight. So, chapter 13 through 23, the God of the nations and victims. Sometimes his titles are not as catchy as, if you were a poet or something, maybe you would, but it's kind of descriptive of what we're going to talk about tonight. So, the God of nations, because we're going to talk about a bunch of nations that are mentioned in these chapters and how God views those nations and how he feels about them and their shenanigans. And then he also is going to make a point about the victims, both the victims of these nations and the nations themselves as victims, victims of God's justice, God's judgment. So some things going on there. By tonight, we want to be able to tell the worldwide influence and power of God. We're going to see kind of a transition, a widening of the frame, a view of the things that Isaiah has been dealing with up to this point, and see God's influence not just on a smaller area, but on a larger scale. And then we're going to explain that God hears the voices of those who are victims. And that's been a recurrent theme already throughout Isaiah, of those that are oppressed, those that are victims, and how God views those who are victims, and how he views those who are victimizing the victims as well. So we'll continue with that theme as we've already seen several times. Our theme for the night, the oracles against the nations describe a God who is more powerful than the most powerful nations of the ancient world, and yet who hears the voices of their victims. And I thought that was a nice contrast to think about God being portrayed as this supreme sovereign being who, even when you have this mighty political, military power that can just basically go and do whatever they want to whomever they want on the planet, and you have God that supersedes them, that is in control of them, that can wipe them out when he wants to, and yet that same God also hears the voices of the victims, hears those that we might consider to be insignificant or small players in the great scheme of things, and yet God hears them. He's not so big and so powerful that he doesn't hear those who are weak, which I thought was an interesting thing to reflect on. Quick review tonight, just of the things that we've been looking at. At its core, Isaiah is a book about God. Not a surprise there. We would expect, books in the Bible to be about God. Specifically, it's about his desire for a relationship with his people. And think about all those ways that we've seen that relationship portrayed. You could probably name them at this point, hopefully as easily as I can, just through the different metaphors that are used to describe that relationship that God wants. We've really been seeing lately his care for the oppressed, and taking note of that as a major theme through the book. We've seen God's judgment executed through discipline. So how does he demonstrate his judgment towards those who don't live the way they're supposed to? Well, he does it through discipline. And remember that discipline in the Bible is, first of all, discipline is teaching. That's the meaning of the word discipline. Second of all, it's always done from love. A father disciplines his child because he loves the child. And so God loves his people, so he disciplines them. And then even in the midst of destruction, there is always hope portrayed in Isaiah. Hope through a remnant, hope through a future seed or a future branch. Hope through the promised Emmanuel, and all of those things. So hope is pervasive throughout the book of Isaiah. Okay, now Lesson 8 preview. We're going to see this expanding view. As if we kind of go back and compare to what we've looked at in chapters 1 through 12, we've had kind of a focused view in on Jerusalem representing the southern kingdom of Judah, and then Samaria or Ephraim representing the northern kingdom of Israel. And then we've had those Syrians and Assyrians thrown in to some extent. So we've really just kind of got a small area geographically that we've been under consideration with up until now. He likened it in the notes. He said, basically, we've been talking about an area about the size of New Jersey. And never been to New Jersey, but it's a lot smaller than Kansas. So it's a smaller area than what we've been looking at up to, than what we would consider to be, a large place at this point. Chapters 13 through 23 are going to focus on the 12 nations of the ancient world, and we'll look at a map here in just a moment. That goes with part of the handout. But those 12 nations basically represent the known world at that time. They would have been the nations that surround Judah and Israel, and that they have the most direct contact with up to this point. And remember that up to this point in Isaiah's world, those European, what we would consider to be European powers, really haven't come into their own yet. They're starting to. There's some major powers coming to play in the world, but really the great military powers up to this point really are those to the east of Israel. And so that was kind of their world up until this point, was that area, and that's what we're going to focus on. So we start out with this kind of tightened, focused view, and then we expand to more of a world view, and then chapters 24 to 27 that hopefully we'll look at next week takes up more cosmic issues, and we're going to talk about things that are bigger than this world, and so more spiritual issues, more kind of universal things that we can learn. So we have this view that expands throughout these chapters of Isaiah. It's kind of an interesting approach or interesting look. All right, let's look at chapters 13 through 23. That's kind of the same slide that I just had, isn't it? Yeah, basically. I don't know why I had them twice. So the 12 nations of Isaiah, I'll give you a second to jot these down. Nations should be all familiar names. I mean, it's not going to be a geography quiz here in a minute, but they should at least be familiar terms that you've heard before, especially in the context of Old Testament study. Many of these are very familiar. So Babylon and Assyria, I think ones that we talk about a lot. Philistia, of course, figures prevalently in the earlier history of Israel, more so than in these later years. Moab, what was the relationship between Moab and Israel? Cousins, yep. Through who? Remember? Whoops. Through Lot, wasn't it? Was it Moab, one of the descendants of Lot through one of his daughters? Damascus, which is, and a couple of them, like Damascus, is a city, but it's the capital of the Aramean Empire. And Aram was one of those nations that figured prevalently in the Exodus, that they tried to get, they didn't want Israel coming near their borders during the Exodus. And so there's a long history of dissension between Israel and Aram going back many, many generations. Ephraim is often a euphemism used for Israel. Who was Ephraim in that lineage? Jacob's son, but not Jacob, Joseph's son. And remember when Jacob went to bless Joseph's sons, what he did? Crossed his hands. And so Ephraim, who was the younger, ends up being the one that receives the blessing. And so we talk about Ephraim as that euphemism, not Manasseh. But it should have been Manasseh because he was the oldest. But Ephraim becomes the kind of the name that Israel is known by. Ethiopia, we'll talk more about in a minute. Egypt, of course, you know that one. Who was Edom?
That's Esau's son.
Esau, yep. Esau was the father of the Edomites, so they're the descendants of Jacob's brother Esau. Arabia, Judah is that southern kingdom. And then Tyre is another one that was a capital city. We'll talk more about that one as it relates to why is, well, let's just throw it in there now. We'll do it when we do the map. All right, everybody good with, if you're writing, you done writing? So we can look at the map here. I don't know, I've got a couple of ways of pointing at things here. So and I probably won't remember that whole list, but can you see that dot? Follow the little red dot. It's not a very bright dot. Jerusalem here, that would be the capital of the southern kingdom. Just above that would be northern Israel, the northern kingdom. We have Moab and Edom here that were close neighbors of Israel. Aram is here. There's Damascus, the capital city of Aram. So the Arameans were just to the north. Assyria here, Babylon over here. Eventually the Persians are going to come from the east and north of Babylon. The Medes and the Persians are going to come from that area. Egypt, of course, down here, and Ethiopia down here off the map. Didn't get that one on there. But what else? What am I missing from the list? Tyre is right here. So Tyre is one of those cities that I think is probably listed. I mean, it's a city. But it's an important city. And the thing that was important about it was its ports. If you wanted to go east from this part of the world, or west, sorry, if you wanted to go west from this part of the world, you had to do one of two things. You had to take an overland route, which was cumbersome and long, or you had to go to Tyre and catch a boat and make a much easier trip. So Tyre was basically that gateway to the rest of the world, to that western world from anywhere in the Israel, Judah part of the world. And so I think that, we don't mention any of those western kingdoms in this list, but Tyre is the gateway to those western kingdoms. So as we think about God having dominion and control over all the things that are mentioned, it's almost as if he's included those western kingdoms there anyway, because of the mention of Tyre. Does that pretty well cover it? Does that get everything on the map there? Let me catch up in my notes with where I'm supposed to be here. So if you read chapters 13 through 20, of course we're not going to be able to, usually we focus on the reading of the text and kind of incorporating that into the lesson. We just can't do that tonight because of the amount of text that we would have to cover. And so we're not going to try to read all those chapters. So if you read 13 through 23, you read some shorter passages, some longer passages about all of those places, talking about judgment against them. It sort of reminds me of back when we studied Ezekiel, way back a couple of years ago, really now at this point, that Ezekiel had long sections like that, where it was a pronouncement of judgment against the nations. If we make it to the end where we have the continuities discussion, we'll talk some about that as well. So we'll jump right in. Well, we're in the middle now. We're not jumping anywhere. But continuing on with the issues that surround the things that we've just looked at. So what is the big deal about these nations? Well, let's look at why the discussion of these nations even matters. And so we have these images of God. Why does it matter that God has control over these four nations? He's not understand the meaning here of what I'm saying. He's not the God of these nations, is he? I mean, he is, but do they recognize him as God? Do they declare him as God? Do they follow him as God? No, they have their own gods.
Well, he created them.
Yeah, he created them just like Aaron. We recognize that he's the God of these nations. But they don't.
Right.
They don't acknowledge him. And so why is it important for him then to go in and sort of establish himself as sovereign over these nations when they don't even want anything to do with him in the first place? Well, it's all about who God is. It's about his character. It's about his sovereignty. It's about his ability to follow through and have the power to do what he claims he's going to do or what he says he's going to do.
We could ask the same question generally in today's standards.
Sure.
Why is it important for God to establish who he is even though people don't acknowledge
Yeah.
him? It's, yeah.
Yeah, it's because he is who he is. I mean, we need them to know who he is. And so he wants them to know. And remember, Israel was supposed to be a kingdom of priests that took his name to the rest of the world, that described who he was to the rest of the world. And when they're not following through on what they're supposed to do and representing him to the rest of the world, then God has to protect his name and he has to establish himself. So we'll look at a few of these, and these again are on your handout. So we have these images of God that are encapsulated or that are captured by all of these declarations of judgment against these nations. And some of them are kind of big ideas, some of them are kind of more specific things. I don't always love his wording in the notes, but there's always something that we can pull out of it and kind of gain from it, I think. So this first picture that he paints is God as general, and he holds up Isaiah 13 verses 2 through 5. And I did put some of the text here in the notes so that we don't have to keep flipping through, but there'll be other places where we need to look at some other passages as well. Some of them are a little longer. So Isaiah 13, 2 through 5 says, "Lift up a standard on the bare hill. Raise your voice to them. Wave the hand that they may enter the doors of the nobles. I've commanded my consecrated ones. I've even called my mighty warriors, my proudly exulting ones, to execute my anger. A sound of tumult on the mountains like that of many people. A sound of the uproar of kingdoms, of nations gathered together. The Lord of hosts is mustering the army for battle. They are coming from a far country, from the farthest horizons, the Lord and his instruments of indignation to destroy the whole land." So how does that portray God as a general? I mean, what in that passage do you read that suggests that God is a general?
He's amassing an army.
He's amassing an army. He's mustering his troops. Who has the authority and the power to do that? It's the commanding officer. He's the one that can call those troops together. He's creating a battle plan. He's getting his implements of war together, his instruments of indignation. From their day and the way they waged war, I can't even imagine what that would represent. They were ruthless in their battles, and so and he is, he's making these plans to destroy the whole land. So God is portrayed here as that battle general that's getting things ready to go and launch a campaign against his enemies. And he's going to start enumerating those enemies. He's going to make a list, and he's going to have a list of people that he's going to employ these things against. He also is portrayed here as a hunter. Isaiah 13 verse 14. "And it will be that like a hunted gazelle or like sheep with none to gather them, they will each turn to his own people and each one flee to his own land." So what is it about God and his pursuit of his enemies that makes him like a hunter?
Well, to be blunt, he kills them.
Okay, he kills them. What
Tracks them down.
Yeah, what defense does the gazelle have against the hunter?
They don't get fast.
They don't really have any defense. I mean, if they can run away, they can get away, or they can certainly outrun me. But think about God as the hunter, as the pursuer. Where is the prey going to hide?
You can't.
They can't. So he has complete dominion over the prey that he is hunting. In fact, he compares him first like a hunted gazelle, or really more like a sheep. I mean, a gazelle, you get one shot at them maybe, and then they're gone because they can, but the sheep, you take a shot at the sheep and it might run a little ways, but it's going to get distracted pretty quick and then start eating again, and then you get another shot. Sheep are, they're pretty stupid. But so God is going to prevail over them because they can't do anything to defend themselves against him. This one was a couple of these are interesting. God as the general, I got that one. That one makes great sense. God as a hunter, okay, that one makes sense. I like that. And then this one, God is a cook. Okay, I'm not sure I would have chosen that word, but look at 13:17. It says, "Behold, I'm going to stir up the Medes against them, who will not value silver or take pleasure in gold." What word there makes you think of God being a cook? Stir. Okay, so I mean, do we have that, is that similar to any phrases we use in our vernacular?
Stirring up trouble.
Stirring up trouble, somebody wants to stir the pot, right? And so, do you like spending time around people that are that way? Not typically. We don't want to be around people that are stirring up trouble. But God is going to stir up the meat. Some of these kingdoms, when Isaiah is prophesying, they're nothing. I mean, there's no indication at this point in history that the Medes are going to be anybody. I mean, they're just kind of a tribe of warlords, and they're nothing historically. And for Isaiah, a couple hundred years before the Medes come into actual power and become the power that overthrow Babylon, by the way, the greatest kingdom that has been seen up to that point, for Isaiah to prophesy and say, God, God's going to bring the Medes into this, and they're going to come in and start stirring up trouble. Nobody sees that coming. Nobody's predicting that. But God is the one that's stirring the pot. He's the one, he's got the recipe. He's got the ingredients to make it happen. And so, it fits. It's, like I said, I don't know that I would have, he's more of a wordsmith than I am to be able to come up with that one. I don't know that I would have come up with that phrasing. What about this one? God as a fighter. Isaiah 14 verses 5 and 6 says, "The Lord has broken the staff of the wicked, the scepter of rulers, which used to strike the peoples in fury with unceasing strokes, which subdued the nations in anger." I think I missed a word there, or a phrase or something. Which used to strike the peoples in fury with unceasing strokes, which subdued the nations in anger with unrestrained persecution. So I missed copying a word there or something. With unrestrained persecution. And then verse 25 says, "To break Assyria in my land, and I will trample him on my mountains. Then his yoke will be removed from them, and his burden removed from their shoulder." So, God is a fighter.
We already knew that.
Yeah, I mean, God's going to prevail when he sets his mind to taking somebody on. But the idea of fighting here, I think, has to do with what is the premise that leads us into this idea of God as a fighter right there at the very beginning.
Breaks the staff.
Broken the staff of the wicked, and what were they using that staff to do?
Strike the people.
To strike the people. They were using that staff, that power, their authority, their whatever, to oppress people, to victimize people. And what is God if he's not a champion of those who are oppressed?
And it says with fury and
Yeah.
unceasing strokes.
And so when God
So the
sees,
people were getting no relief.
when he sees them being victimized, when he sees them being oppressed, God goes to war. He goes to battle, and he's ready to take them on. So God is a fighter, but he's not a brawler. He's not one that just goes around picking fights and looking for fights. He's one that sees a cause and takes up a mantra, takes up a cause, takes up a reason, and becomes a champion for those who need someone to fight on their behalf. And that's why God is a fighter. I changed this one. I didn't like the way he worded this one at all. It said, "God is a cleaning lady," so I changed it to custodian. I was like, really? But God is a custodian. I said, "I will also make it a possession for the hedgehog and swamps of water, and I will sweep it with the broom of destruction, declares the Lord of hosts." Here he is talking about, I just went blank. He's talking about one of the capital cities, judgment on Assyria. No, that's next.
Babylon?
Babylon, yeah. So he's talking about Babylon, and so he's going to make it a possession for the hedgehog. He's going to make it a barren place. I mean, what is that place now? It's a barren desert. And he swept it clean of all the things that made it profitable, things that made it desirable up to that point. So God is a custodian. He's going to go in and clean house. This next one is interesting. Portrays God crying. It's chapter 16, verse 9. Therefore I will weep bitterly for Jazer, for the vine of Sibmah. I will drench you with my tears, O Heshbon and Elilah, for the shouting over your summer fruits and your harvest has fallen away. What is it that makes God weep?
Our sins, the lives that we choose that are not in accordance to His will.
This is not what God wanted for any of the people of the world. God doesn't want their destruction. He doesn't want their pain. He doesn't want their, their suffering. And when He sees them suffering, He weeps. Does that remind you of any New Testament passages? Jesus weeping over Jerusalem. Oh, Jerusalem, Jerusalem, how I long to gather you together as a hen gathers her chicks. But you were not willing. And that's the relationship that we see with God in Isaiah. How He longed to have that close relationship with Him, but they were unwilling. And not even just with His chosen people, but He would have cherished that relationship with any people that would have allowed Him or followed Him. And so He weeps over their suffering. God as the pruner, chapter 18, verse 5. For before the harvest, as soon as the bud blossoms and the flower becomes a ripening grape, then He will cut off the sprigs with pruning knives and remove and cut away the spreading branches. Why does pruning take place?
Cuts away the dead.
Cuts away the dead, the unproductive,
So that new growth can enter.
makes room for new growth. And so here in this is a judgment against Ethiopia specifically, but Ethiopia doesn't figure prominently into many of the Old Testament stories, but yet they were still a nation that would have been right to the south of Egypt, and they would have been supportive of Egypt in many of her battles that came up into the Israel and Judah area. So anytime Egypt comes up, Ethiopia is most likely always with them as an ally, so would have been included in that judgment against Egypt as well. And so God is a pruner. Again, does that remind you of anything from the New Testament?
I am the vine.
I'm the vine, you're the branches. And so branches that don't bear fruit,
Okay.
what happened?
They're cut away and thrown into
Yep,
the fire.
they're trimmed and cut into thrown into the fire. They're useless, and so they're removed.
Talks about grafting in the,
Romans, yeah,
grafting in the new branches or the new,
Right.
because the old ones aren't producing.
yep. So that Israel was pruned, and the Gentiles were grafted in, and then Paul does remind them, we could always prune you out and graft the old ones back in if that's what needs to happen, if that becomes more productive. So that's right. God is the pruner. And then 19:1 has God riding on a cloud. The oracle concerning Egypt. Behold, the Lord is riding on a swift cloud and is about to come to Egypt. The idols of Egypt will tremble at His presence, and the heart of the Egyptians will melt within them. What does that signify? What does that mean? Riding on a cloud.
I'm thinking like a warrior, but maybe not.
Like a cloud of dust that their horses come in on, or
Warriors ride on horses.
yeah, right. What's that?
So it makes a good song.
Makes a good song. Yeah, there's some imagery in other places of God, amongst the clouds. Revelation has some of that imagery as well, and it is a portrayal of power. It's a portrayal of sovereignty. It's a portrayal of omnipresence. Where do clouds not go? Even over a desert, you'll see clouds, and so clouds go everywhere. They're omnipresent. When was the last time we saw God in some sort of a cloudy presence associated with Egypt?
Well, He led them by a cloud and pillar.
Burning bush.
Burning bush, God was there, and
A pillar
Mount Sinai, and the pillar of cloud that led them by day and the pillar of fire by night. And so think of that from an Egyptian perspective. You know, the last time we had anything to do with God, he was leaving our borders in the form of a cloud, and our army was just destroyed and our Pharaoh was killed. And now here comes a cloud coming to us that represents God. Is that going to be a welcome sight?
Depends who you are, where you are.
Well,
in your
not
relationship.
Egypt, not for the Egyptians. They probably want nothing to do with that cloud. So the heart of the Egyptians will melt within them. You know, they know the story. Even though it's been a long time, they know the story. And they don't want that to come back. So their heart will melt. Next verse, 19:2. God is heat. And this one I had to think about a little bit. But I think there's a key word there. So it says, so I will incite Egyptians against Egyptians, and they will fight against his brother, and each against his neighbor, city against city, and kingdom against kingdom. So what word there makes you think of heat?
Insight.
Incite. That was the one I thought of. And think of again, it kind of goes back to the God as cook, where he's stirring things up, right? And so when somebody is inciting somebody else, you know, they're maybe not.
Egging them on.
Yeah, I see that in middle school all the time. You have, I know that guy's mad at that guy over there, so you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to go tell him what he just said, and then when he says something, I'm going to go tell him what he said, and then before you know it, we're just going to stand back and watch, and
Okay.
you see that happen all the time.
Oh, both turn on that one.
Yeah, and so God is inciting Egyptians against Egyptians. He's inciting, they'll fight against their brothers, they'll against their own neighbors, their cities and their kingdoms against one another. So God is sovereign. He's going to stir them up. Are there other places where armies turned on one another? There was one time when the army was surrounding, who's the guy with the 300 men? Gideon. When they broke the pots and the torches, and they shouted, and everybody in the camp thought they were under attack, so they all grabbed their neighbor and killed him. They just turned on one another. They thought, wow, all this big racket, we must be under attack, so whoever's closest to me must be an enemy. And they just started hacking one another. And so it's that kind of picture being painted there, where he's just turning them against one another. God has that ability to incite one another, or to incite them. And then this one, again, one of those easy ones, I think, easy ones for us to make the connection with, or to see the imagery here. Isaiah 22:5, God is soldier, for the Lord God of hosts has a day of panic, subjugation, and confusion in the valley of vision, of breaking down of walls and a crying to the mountain. It's that phrase, God of hosts, and Isaiah uses that phrase a lot. There's several different interpretations of that phrase, but one of those is a military interpretation. God of hosts is the Lord of the army. He is the God of armies. And so he has those soldiers at his disposal, and he knows how to use them to accomplish his will. A day of panic, subjugation, and confusion. Sounds like an algebra test in my classroom, but maybe not. That fill out that section? Okay. You're not taking notes? Oh my. You embarrassed me in front of all these people.
No.
All right, God's plan, God's power is what we'll talk about next. So that first section, the striking images of God, just the portrayal of God in these with these striking images of power and might and all those things. So he has next these striking images. Let's see, God is more powerful than the most powerful nation. So when we think about that list of 12 nations, there are some heavy hitters on there. Assyria was no slouch. Babylon is, they're a big deal. Egypt, they've been around a long, long time, and they've been a very powerful nation for many, many years. Even some of those smaller nations had their moments of great victories and moments of great military defeat. So So this list of nations is not a small thing, but God is portrayed all along the way as more powerful than all of them. So what does that mean? Why do we care that God is more powerful? Well, first of all, God's plans will prevail. And so 14 verse 24 says, that's where I'll have to start thumbing through. I didn't have enough room to put the passage and the points. So 14:24, the Lord of hosts has sworn, saying, surely just as I have intended, so it has happened, and just as I have planned, so it will stand. God's plans will prevail. So he will not, God doesn't plan something and then have to go back to the drawing board because that plan didn't work. That's the way a lot of times things are portrayed as far as, kingdom matters and things, things related to the idea of kingdom in the New Testament. A lot of people want to suggest that, well, God made a stab at it with Jesus of establishing a kingdom, but it didn't really work out. And so now plan B was the church, and then Jesus will come back and there'll be another try at the kingdom. Well, that's just false. It doesn't make any sense. God's plans don't fail. His plans prevail. What we have is what God intended. And so we can be sure of that. God is, and we won't look at all these we don't have the time to look at all the passages that are listed here in the subpoints, but God is not restrained by normal human restrictions. So the things that would stop you and me from being successful don't have any bearing on God. God is not stopped or thwarted by the things that would stop or thwart us. God used violence to oppose human arrogance and violence. There are times when God kind of fights fire with fire. And it's okay because he's just. He's perfect in his understanding of justice. And so if we're going to go out and kill people, God is going to kill us back. And that's kind of the way it goes. If we're going to mistreat people, God's going to mistreat us. If we're going to oppress people, God's going to oppress us. And we see that unfolding through many of the things that are pronounced against these people in Isaiah, because the things that they do to other people, God just kind of turns that back around on them sometimes and says, well, you've been doing X, Y, and Z, so guess what you're going to have to live through now? X, Y, and Z. It's coming right back at you. God upsets normal world power structures. Wouldn't that be a neat superpower to have? If we could just decide that we wanted to have one of God's characteristics or qualities, that might be a neat one. Where, yeah, Russia, you're going to go in and attack somebody? Well, no, you're not. Snap her fingers and we don't let them do it. God upsets normal world power structures. The team that you think is going to win doesn't always win when God is involved. Next, I think there was a typo on the handout here if you're keeping track. I think maybe this one, or maybe the next one. There's two in a row that use the word nations, but I think one of them is wrong. So the next one here, God controls the nations. And I mean, we could look at every one of those 12 nations and see passages or parts of the passage that would talk about that. But the kind of the big one there is Babylon, and it starts with Babylon. God has control over Babylon all through chapter 13. And that makes no sense. It doesn't make sense that a kingdom as strong and as powerful as Babylon would be subjugated to any force or power. But that's worldly wisdom. That's physical thinking. That doesn't take into account who God is. And God is the one that controls the nations. And so they are subjugated to him. They are under his control. And then nations will recognize the authority, sovereignty, and existence of God. Look at 17:7. Let's look at that one. In that day, man will have regard for his maker, and his eyes will look to the Holy One of Israel. And who is this? This is in an oracle against Damascus, so against the Arameans, who did not recognize God's authority when Israel was in the Exodus and they were trying to find safe passage, and they wanted just to walk on the road. We won't even step off the road. We'll just walk on the road through your territory. And they said, nope, we won't let you do it. And now they're going to have to acknowledge who God is. So, but again, we could look at a lot of the nations. Did the king of Babylon ever have to acknowledge who God was? He lived out in the field, not wearing clothes for like 7 years or something, while God was waiting for him to realize who he was. And then finally Nebuchadnezzar realized it, and he proclaimed God. And so this happens over and over again as well. that they will recognize the authority and sovereignty of God. God controls the physical universe. Some wonderful passages, not just in this section of Isaiah, but in other parts of Isaiah as well, about God's relationship to the physical world. And these are some great passages. God controls the planets. Chapter 13, verse 10. We don't look at all these, but kind of one of my favorite topics. 13:10, for the stars of the heaven and their constellations will not flash forth their light. The sun will be dark when it rises. The moon will not shed its light. God has that. I can't make that statement. I can't proclaim that, you know what, tomorrow night the stars aren't going to shine, or tomorrow night the moon's not going to show up. But God can, and he has the power to do those things. He exerts control over nature. He has control over the weather and control over the seas in various passages there. God knows the world. Which is, again, we got people that think they know a lot, and then there are people that really know a lot, and then there's God. But look at 19:12 through 14. Well, look at 11. The princes of Zoan are mere fools. The advice of Pharaoh's wisest advisors have become stupid. How can you men say to Pharaoh, I am a son of the wise, a son of ancient kings? Well then, where are your wise men? Please let them tell you, and let them understand what the Lord of hosts has purposed against Egypt. The princes of Zoan have acted foolishly. The princes of Memphis are deluded. Those who are the cornerstone of her tribes have led Egypt astray. The Lord has mixed within her a spirit of distortion. They have led Egypt astray in all that it does, as a drunken man staggers in his vomit. And there will be no work for Egypt, which its head or tail, its palm branch or bulrush may do. So compared to God, the wise men of Egypt are stumbling drunks.
Stumbling in their own vomit.
Yeah, I mean, I wasn't going to say that again, but thank you.
You're welcome.
So yeah, they are, the wisest men that Egypt has to offer are bumbling fools. And God is able to outwit them because of his wisdom. God knows about international events. And so, turn on the radio or the TV and listen to people trying to figure out what's going on in the world today. And as smart as we are in our wisdom, you'll hear two people saying complete opposite things. At least one of them's got to be wrong, but they're probably both wrong. But God knows international events. He knows the wheres and the whys and the hows of all the things that are going on. And all these passages place that into clear view. God changes the world, which is another interesting thing to just kind of ponder. God doesn't just know the world, but he brings about changes within the world. So he's able to guide things as he wants them to be. He brings about change in unexpected places. So again, we said a minute ago, it's not always the team you think is going to win that ends up winning. It's not always the biggest army or the strongest army or the most, the wisest king that wins these battles. Sometimes God has a hand in it, and things don't go the way you expect. And then he made the comment, note how world superpowers experience change. And he was saying that within the context of Isaiah in their day and those things. But we could just as easily make that statement for our world today, that it doesn't always end up the way we think it would end up. And so God has a hand in changing all of those things through the different interactions that he has with all of these nations. Okay, so that finishes that section, and we've got this section. God hears the voice of victims. And I'll get caught up again. There we are. It was common for people to live under oppressive rulers in the ancient world. It's kind of common in our world today that people live under oppressive rulers. You don't have to travel to very many third world countries or places in Africa or Latin America where despotism and rulers that are not nice people have ruined a lot of lives.
What was that word you just used?
Despotism? Was that the one? Despots, bad people, rulers. So through these chapters, we see several places where victims are under consideration. So here we won't read this whole thing, but chapter 14, verses 4 through 23, the victims speak out against their oppressors. So this is a taunt song, he calls it, that the victims in Jerusalem sing against their wicked oppressors. Well, who had been oppressing Jerusalem? Assyria had come to, the last part of chapter 14, Assyria is against Assyria, judgment against Philistia, there's judgment on Moab, there's judgment on Edom. All of these people at various times have played a part in harming Jerusalem in some way, or harming Judah in some way. And so this is Israel's taunt song singing about them. And it's a mockery because it makes it sound like, hey, you guys did an awesome job of hurting us. You guys really knew how to do some bad things, and good job. Is kind of the way parts of this read. And so they're speaking out against their oppressors, but they're doing it in a mocking and a taunting way. It's not good to be good at hurting people. And when you get accused of that, that's a bad thing. So they lay this all out there.
Jason, verse 10 or
Uh-huh.
12 is sometimes misapplied to Satan.
Okay.
How you fall from heaven, O morning star, son of the dawn, you've been cast down to earth, you who once laid low the nations. My notes say that's probably referring to Babylon, not Satan.
Yeah, and it is, you can see how it's a taunting. You have fallen from heaven, O star of, verse 12, O star of the morning, son of the dawn. You've been cut down to the earth. So, this nation that has oppressed them, that has done evil and wicked things to them, they're referring to this nation as, the morning star, as, a bright and wonderful thing. So, you can see how that taunt is playing into it. And you're right, it is misapplied, as many things are misapplied in the Bible. Our next section here is the victims cry out about their oppression. And so first they cry out against their oppressors, but they also cry out about the fact that they're being oppressed. So 15, 1 through 9 is a song of grief sung out by victims in Moab. And so, the oracle of Moab, surely in the night of Ar, Moab is devastated and ruined. Surely in the night, in a night, Kir of Moab is devastated and ruined. So, interestingly, Moab is one of those nations that God pronounces judgment against. And yet here, in experiencing the judgment that God has poured out, now they are crying out about the fact that they're being oppressed. They're crying out and saying, this hurts. This is not fun for us to have to go through this devastation. And so they're crying out about their oppression. Does that ever happen any other places in the Bible? Even some of the prophets. Did Daniel cry out about the oppression of his people? Did Ezekiel cry out about the oppression of Habakkuk? You have these guys that were faithful, awesome prophets, and they go through this misery and they cry out to God and say, this hurts. This is not fun. We're being oppressed because of our sin. We don't like it.
The saints under the table in Revelation,
Oh yeah, right. Under God's throne, the saints who are martyred under God's throne cry out to him, how long? How long until we are avenged? You've promised us that we will be. How long do we have to wait? And so they cry out because of their oppression. So there's some interesting points there. God, here's the voice of the victims here. The victims seek help during their oppression. So 16, 1 through 5, again, is Moab. And Moab, in their oppression, has the gall, has the nerve to send emissaries to Judah and say, hey, can y'all help us? After all that Moab has done, Moab and Edom were two nations that often were not powerful enough to go against Judah or Israel on their own. But anytime anybody wanted to go to battle against Judah or Israel, here's our road, whatever we have is yours, let's go do it. And they allied themselves often against, with nations that were against Israel and Judah. And so So now Moab is being oppressed, and who do they turn to? The nation that they have often oppressed themselves. And so they do not find relief from Judah, by the way, when they seek refuge from their oppression. And then the prideful oppressors become Yahweh's victims. So God is going to have his justice on the people who have been oppressing others through their oppression. They are going to be oppressed, and it comes about as a punishment because of their oppression of others. So some of those who suffer deserve their punishment. God in 16:6-14. So right after that section we just mentioned where Moab turns to Judah and cries out because of their oppression, the very next section is, here's what God thinks of you. You don't deserve relief from your oppression. God sent the oppression. It's because of God that you're being oppressed. And so you don't get relief from that. Same as with Damascus and Samaria. They had allied themselves against Judah, and they were not going to receive relief from their oppression as well. Okay, we made it this far to continuity. So quickly, because we've got 2 minutes, how do modern day views of God differ from the depiction of God in Isaiah? Or do they?
Depends who you're talking
Well, there you go.
Most people want to view God as being all forgiving and,
Yeah.
and merciful.
Okay. So this idea of justice, discipline, God oppressing people, God turning the tables on oppressors, those kind of things. People don't like to hear that. Now, if you're going to say, those people over there have been oppressing me, and God's going to go oppress them for a while, okay, I can probably get behind that. But if I find out I'm the one that's being punished or disciplined because of my sins, that's not the God I want to serve, right? That's the way most people view it. And so, as long as we're talking about God dealing out justice to other people, okay, we can have that conversation. But I don't deserve it.
about. They
Tim?
don't like to hear about chastening either.
They don't do what?
Have themselves chastened, they don't like that.
Yeah. Yeah, we don't want to be reproved. We don't want to be chastened. You're exactly right. So there's so much we can learn about God, about the character of God through these Old Testament prophecies and passages. And it is the same God. There's a lot of people that I really, really don't like that phrase, the God of the Old Testament, or that we don't like that Old Testament God or something like that. There is one God, and he's the same God of the Old Testament and New Testament. There is grace in the Old Testament, there is justice and retribution in the New Testament. We need to reconcile those ideas and realize that we serve the same God that Isaiah describes for us here. God's judgment of foreign nations is a major component of Old Testament prophecy, not just in Isaiah, but we talk about Ezekiel. There's passages in Daniel, the minor prophets that's scattered all throughout the prophecies and through the history books as well. So that's a major theme. How does the theme relate to our understanding of God's judgment today? Something to think about. We're out of time. Thank you, Chuck. Isaiah 24-27 next week.